Well, hello. Welcome to Rising. It is Wednesday morning, and we've got a big day of news ahead of us. So let's get right to it. Good morning, Brianna.
Good morning, Robbie.
What's going on?
Big news day indeed. It's the third time's the charm, maybe, for President Donald Trump. He has, of course, been indicted again, this time by federal grand jury on charges stemming from January 6th and what prosecutors allege are Trump's efforts to overturn the 2020 election. Special counsel Jack Smith's office accuses Trump of heading a criminal conspiracy of, quote, dishonesty, fraud, and conceit to interfere with a, quote, bedrock function of democracy. Per the 45-page indictment, Trump spread lies that he had won the election knowing they were false. Ultimately, he was charged with conspiracy to defraud the United States, witness tampering, and conspiracy against the rights of citizens and obstruction of an official proceeding.
Now, also listed but not named in the indictment are 6 co-conspirators who will be charged alongside Trump. The Hill has reported on the identity of 5 of those individuals. The first is, of course, Rudy Giuliani, who prosecutors accuse of pressuring lawmakers to falsify election results on behalf of Trump. Second is John Eastman. Smith's office claims Eastman headed the pressure campaign on Mike Pence to obstruct the certification of the 2020 election results. And the third is Sidney Powell. Powell accused of publicly amplifying false election claims. Then there is Jeffrey Clark, a former Justice Department official who prosecutors say attempted to leverage the DOJ to open sham election crime investigations. Also, Kenneth Chesborough, accused of devising the, quote, fake elector scheme. The 6th co-conspirator is a yet-to-be-identified political consultant.
Well, the man at the center of it all, of course, spoke out against the allegations against him. Trump called the new charges disgraceful and unprecedented political targeting. He posted a slew of videos on Truth Social overnight, including this supercut titled Democrats Denying Election Results.
How can you win with Russian interference, though?
That's a real
what I'm
thing.
scared about in 2020.
But rightly.
Because I think he's an illegitimate president that didn't really win. So how do you fight against that in 2020?
You are absolutely right.
He's an illegitimate president in my mind.
Would you be my vice presidential candidate? Folks, look, I absolutely agree.
Trump didn't actually win the election in 2016. He lost the election, and he was put in office because the Russians interfered.
Trump knows he's an illegitimate president.
So what did you make of the indictment?
I think it's trouble for Donald Trump. The reality is that there is a huge difference. I agree from when we're talking about the speech rights and how things are handled online and the hypocrisy of Democrats saying any number of things like we just saw in the clip while not getting censored, while conservatives who say that Trump should be the president right now are getting censored. That inconsistency is really real and worth pointing out. But this context is not a censorship campaign on Twitter or Facebook or whatever. The context here is whether or not election law was violated. And the charges in this indictment aren't that Trump said that the election was stolen. It's that he knowingly, with no evidence that the election was stolen, having been advised repeatedly by any number of advisors to him and people close to him who were invested in him actually succeeding, telling him that there was no evidence of election fraud, attempting to overturn the results of election by coercing, reaching out to secretaries of state and other officials in local elections and imploring them to either find more votes or to fail to certify the official slate of electors, this so-called fake elector scheme, to try to undermine the will of the people in those states. And if there's evidence that Hillary Clinton or Jimmy Carter and any other people in that clip did those things, I absolutely agree that they should be indicted. But I think that that's a significant difference here.
I don't know how you quite get around, though, the speech element of this. So obviously the indictment begins, notes that Donald Trump lost the presidential election. Despite having lost, the defendant was determined to remain in power, and he describes the things he said that were false, and then says, well, of course he has a right, like every American, to say things that end up being false, but then that's exactly what they're charging him over. So where in the indictment it is explained, and also the knowing he knows it's false. Do any of us believe that? Do we really think Trump knows that he did not win the election and said these things anyway? I think he's perfectly convinced that he did.
So that's the argument many conservative media have been going with, that Trump is too stupid, I guess, to have the requisite mens rea to know that
it's not like he's surrounded by just people who are saying that you lost, it's over, sir. He was surrounded by some of those same people who are being co-indicted, who argued to him that he had won. So, for example, there is a lot of cited email transcripts and other written documents that people have where co-conspirator one, who we believe is Rudy Giuliani, said things like, "We don't have the evidence
but we have lots of theories. As he was having a conversation with the Arizona campaign manager, who was coming back saying the rumors that were circulating that non-citizens had voted and therefore the election totals were false were unsubstantiated, that they had no evidence of that in the state. Co-conspirator one, again, Rudy Giuliani, asked the Arizona House Speaker to use the legislature to circumvent the process by which legitimate electors would be ascertained for Biden based on the popular vote and replace those electors with a new slate for the defendant. The Arizona Speaker refused, responding that the suggestion was beyond anything he had ever heard or thought of as being within his authority. So again, the question is not whether Trump or any other president can say, I think I should have won that election. The question is whether or not you can call up state officials or send your emissaries on behalf of you to engage with state officials, to ask them to fail to certify election results, rely on fake electors, to ignore the will of the popular vote in the state on the basis of what you admit are simply theories without evidence. Do I think the Trump campaign absolutely had a right to investigate those theories, to see if there was merit to them, to interrogate whether or not there was any campaign voter fraud? Absolutely. But at a certain point, when your own Justice Department and everybody in your own administration is telling you that they've looked and they simply cannot find the evidence, and you know that to be true and continue to misrepresent that reality, that's what he's being charged with. And we'll see if it holds up in court. But that's a very different thing than what we're seeing from Hillary and those others in the clip.
So there are three parts of this alleged criminal conspiracy on his part. What do you make of the part of it that is with reference to the proceeding on January 6th, a conspiracy to corruptly obstruct and impede the January 6th congressional proceeding, at which the results are tallied and affirmed by Mike Pence and that whole thing? Again, and this is similarly to how many of the people who actually went into the Capitol were charged with this, impeding a official government function, that kind of thing. Again, Trump didn't smash any windows at the Capitol. He didn't go and knock over, defile Nancy Pelosi's desk. This seems, I don't know, very close to the whole he's being charged for legally causing a riot, in a legal sense causing a riot, not just for grossly immoral conduct, which I would totally agree with. Yeah, so it does seem, first of all, claims are usually listed in the order of their strength. So I do think that is subordinate to some of these other claims here, like the ones I was just describing. What the indictment makes clear is that Vice President Mike Pence potentially played a really significant, what could have played a significant role in actually effectuating the plan. It reads that the defendant and co-conspirators intended to enlist Pence to use a ceremonial role at the January 6th certification proceeding to fraudulently alter the election results, first using knowingly false claims of election fraud. They attempted to convince the vice president to use the defendant's fraudulent electors, this is the fake elector scheme again, reject legitimate electoral votes or send legitimate electoral votes to state legislatures for review rather than counting them. So again, as we discussed yesterday, this scheme involved the reality that if for some reason you cannot appropriately tally the results in the states, eventually you do get to a point where the House of Representatives is electing the president, not on the basis of proportional representation, but on the pure one vote per state, which could potentially result in a president winning that would not have won the Electoral College. So Pence opted out. He refused to do that. And the argument is that when that became clear, the crowd was encouraged to come and storm the Capitol and pose this kind of a threat, et cetera, et cetera. I do, as I've always said, think that the focus on the events of the day of 1/6 are much weaker than the premeditated attempts prior to 1/6 and the force exerted by Donald Trump and his cohort to try to get state officials to lie about what they knew to be true in terms of the election results. However, I think that they put it in there because I don't think we can have spent 2 years, 3 years talking about 1/6 and the events of the day and know how animating that is for people in the public imagination and not throw in that Trump is in some way culpable for inciting that riot or inciting the riot with the purpose of actually pressuring Pence to follow through on this kind of a plan. He was impeached for that conduct, I think rightly, and they did not vote to remove him from office. And that's that was the correct course of action given that day's events. It feels like we're trying to relitigate something that was already litigated.
Sure. So that I would agree, but there's those other counts of the indictment, and so I wonder what you think about that. What do you think about all of this substantial evidence of Donald Trump and the co-conspirators trying to pressure state officials to ignore the election results, the will of the people, the voting counts, for which these Republican officials said that we looked and we just found absolutely no evidence of election interference? We're all familiar with the Raffensperger call at this point, where Donald Trump specifically called for a certain number of votes to be found. But additionally, for example, this is the Arizona House Speaker says, I'm a conservative Republican. I don't like the results of the presidential election. I voted for President Trump and worked hard to reelect him, but I cannot and will not entertain a suggestion that we violate current law to change the outcome of a certified election. I mean, what do you make of all of these really Trump-sympathetic people who simply told the president, there's no there, and yet the president continued to try to exert his influence to change the election outcome?
Right. Well, he was persistent in his false belief that he had actually won, and he pursued many means of getting state officials to validate the claim that he was making. And as you pointed out, his own Republican, very conservative officials everywhere, courts everywhere, state elections officials everywhere, told him that he was wrong, and his effort failed. I do think, obviously, like, this is the prosecutor's case. You know, we were going to hear from, he's entitled to his defense as well. But a lot of this looks like speech adjacent, that the things that he said were wrong and bad, and now we're rounding that up to fraud. Even though fraud usually requires an element of you've actually, like, you know, swindled someone out of some financial cause, right, for it to be fraud?
No, it doesn't have to be. Fraud doesn't have to result in some kind of financial fraud. Absolutely not.
I believe the Supreme Court, I thought they just affirmed that.
You can have fraud on a person. You can mislead people in all kinds of ways. We were talking about the Andrew Tate case, where obviously money is involved because he's stealing these people's, you know, these people are on sex camera doing work for him. But it's also it's broader than just simply a financial case. So no, this is perfectly valid from a fraud perspective. That's not the issue. Like, it is a little disturbing. Like, what is the argument here that a sitting president, having absolutely no evidence, admittedly having no evidence of election fraud, can try to coerce and pursue, in violation of election law, to change the state officials in order to change the election
law
result?
Can't override his First Amendment right to speak his mind about what happened.
You cannot simply slap First Amendment on everything. If I lie to you to steal your money, that's also speech. All speech is not, you know this, Robbie, all speech is not constitutionally protected. And fraud obviously is included among those things. Do you want there to be an election law or not? Do you want there to be a law that restrains the ability of a president to coerce state officials to undermine the public will of American citizens who went to an election box and registered their democratic will, or not? You know, I can deal with you.
You've got to be very careful here. It's political speech. It's political speech we don't like that was incorrect. I agree.
You're saying his private correspondence, his private leaning on the Secretary of State in these various states, Republican members of these states, is protected speech and not constitute squeezing them and coercing them.
He didn't threaten their families. He didn't. It wasn't a mob hit. He said, I think that I won. He cited evidence, again, that was wrong. The reason they should do what he wanted, and they should look at that evidence, and they didn't do that. And I think it's dicier than... I think the correct remedy for this was to impeach and remove him from office. I'm not saying he should get away with this. There should be no consequence for it. But we did the thing that was the proper consequence.
Well, I think...
And the people who wanted him gone lost, and they're big mad about that, and so we're still adjudicating it years later.
I think the problem is that the impeachment did not actually focus on the pre-1/6 event. They focused on the idea that storming the Capitol was the crime itself. And I think that was a fundamental flaw on the part of the Democrats.
If he gets elected, they can impeach him again, I guess.
And that's an issue. But, I mean, this feels like, I don't know, if it were difficult and I felt the same way in the Dominion voting case, the defense would have a better claim if they had not very foolishly, but of their own volition, written down repeatedly that they knew that there was no election fraud.
But that's not the case for Trump.
Yes. Yes, it is. When he tells someone...
When he said it in an interview with Caitlin Collins in that town hall the other week, and he said, "No, I absolutely won. Didn't you see all these things?"
Right. That's what's being publicly said.
You think he doesn't think in his head that he did win?
Privately, as evidenced by this indictment, his co-conspirators, who are acting as his agents, are saying, "We know there is no evidence for this fraud. We would like you to do this thing anyway." So, it's a judiciable issue. The courts will go through it and decide, and there will be a trial, and it'll come out what it will come out. But we cannot sit here and pretend that there's not a claim here, that there is no wrongdoing here, or that this is just a speech issue. And I gotta say, speech issues are very important. The First Amendment is incredibly important. And using it the way that conservatives have done of late, as an effort to wrap everything they don't like in a constitutional shield, is going to backfire at some point in a way that I think will significantly impair our substantive speech rights, because it doesn't mean anything anymore. It's starting to not mean anything at all. But we'll have a lot more on this, I'm sure. There's still some unknowns about who the sixth co-conspirator actually is, and we'll be talking to Alan Dershowitz later in the show, who will give his insight into
it'll be great to get
some
his
of the
take
legal
as well.
analysis here.
More Rising right after this.